It's time to switch on.
Today's News Talk Radio. Very entertaining. Yeah! TNT.
Welcome back. And we have Freddie Ponton online, independent journalist from France. Speaking of Europe, I would like to get Freddie's comments on those comments by the top foreign policy chief in Brussels, Joseph Borrell. But we'll get to that a little bit later. We're also going to be doing a deep dive in this segment into some of the claims made about October 7th. As you may know, it was this narrative that was used to justify the Israeli response against the native Palestinian population in Gaza, and it's been a horrific response. It's ended up in the international courts of justice with a genocide case currently being looked at, and the carnage continues as we speak. It hasn't abated, hasn't stopped. Freddie's been looking at some different aspects of this, including claims by the Israelis initially that Hamas was committing mass rape and those mass sexual assault, sex as a weapon, shades of claims that Gaddafi was issuing Viagra back in 2011. Everybody remembers that. All of these things are hugely emotive, and they're usually used to justify a powerful military and aggressive military response to some kind of threat. This is the narrative anyway. Freddie's on the line right now. Freddie, thank you for joining us this week on TNT.
It's a pleasure, Patrick. Good to be here.
Now, Freddie, as we know, this October 7th narrative means everything, really, because it's all the claims that were made initially by the Israelis, by the mainstream media, by the allies of Israel, namely the United States, Britain, and the EU. Those claims of what Hamas did on October 7th have been used to justify some of the worst crimes against humanity, some of the worst war crimes anyone's witnessed in the modern era. So this isn't a trivial matter, Freddie, is what I'm saying. So every single detail on this, any claims made, they matter. They're hugely consequential. Just give us your opening statement on October 7th, something you've been looking at in granular detail for the last 5 months. But go ahead.
Yes, it's indeed. It's all in the details, as you just said. And I think for those that have followed for the past 4.5 months, the conflict between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, then surely people will have noticed a lot of inconsistency, but also a relentless efforts on the Israeli part to trying to convince not only their own people, their own public, but also to convince the rest of the world that what they are doing in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is completely justified. And in order to do that and to justify these particular crimes or alleged crimes, then the activities, of course, of the Israeli defense or attack forces, depending on how you see it. But what was very important to me was that we've seen a pattern of behaviors from the Israeli that is very, very worrying. And that is to literally build up a narrative, a consensus amongst themselves and their allies in order to sell the idea that, first of all, that the Hamas are terrorists, so no one could entertain the possibility they were freedom fighters. And then if it was not enough, then it was important to portray them as rapists so that the entire portrait of Hamas will be basically a portrait of horror, if you will, making sure that these people are basically described as evil as possible and these are the bad guys. And that is the reason why Israel is cleaning up and partaking in a genocide in the Gaza Strip. So that's basically what Israel has been doing since the October the 7th. So it's important, of course, to not only analyze their modus operandi, the various units in the Shin Bet or IDF responsible for this Hasbara kind of a way of doing things, as they describe it themselves, this propaganda machine that is relentless and that is extremely gifted in staging a lot of their theaters, whether it's within the conflict zone itself, within the Gaza Strip, but also, as we're going to see in a moment as well, in the sites where the October 7 attacks took place. So indeed, very interesting to see the United Nations having an official visit to Israel to basically gather informations about the October the 7th. And I'm going to really kind of give you a good understanding of what was the context, what was said, and what was the findings. And I think it's going to be very interesting for the public to understand that what we are currently witnessing is a complete, basically, propaganda exercise. And it's a shame, as far as I'm concerned, that the UN has actually entertained this kind of game.
No, absolutely. We'll get to that in a moment. And the piece that you're breaking down here, I think, is really the key piece because of all the claims made, you've got beheaded babies, that notorious claim. This has been sort of thoroughly debunked many times over. We've got all sorts of anecdotal second, third-hand claims, or somebody will come to the media and say, I just saw a WhatsApp message that showed Hamas did X, Y, and Z to some settler in a kibbutz on October 7th. Ergo, what a terrible terrorist act. We need to go and smash Hamas and relentlessly in Gaza. So I just published a featured article which just came out in New Dawn magazine out of Australia, and that came out this week, and the title is Lies, Damn Lies, and Propaganda, Western Media and the War on Gaza. And I looked at all the different aspects in terms of the claims, Freddie, of the October 7th narrative, and from the 40 beheaded babies, and looked at the friendly fire issue, of course, not so friendly for Israeli civilians who were killed by the IDF. This is well documented by now. So you have all these different areas. The Hannibal Directive, for instance, the killing of captive Israelis by the IDF. This is a policy, and so forth. But nothing is as emotive as mass rape, Freddie. We all know this triggers the Western dog whistle for Western audiences to get riled up. It's the global Me Too movement kicks into gear. So you get people in the US and Europe saying that's the most horrific aspect of all. Look at what they did to their women. Therefore, these people are savages. So it's weapons free, isn't it, Freddie, at that point? It really justifies a disproportional response in the eyes of the Israelis and their supporters. So this is why it's important to break down the facts on this, Freddie. And guess what? Looks like the facts are coming out on this, but share your findings with us, if you will.
Well, the circumstances behind the latest trip, the United Nations, basically representative to the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, a lady called Pramila Patten, basically went with a team of experts of the United Nations, 9 of them invited by the Israeli government under the pressures of different institutions to come and report, if you will, and gather informations with regards to October the 7th attacks and the alleged conflict related sexual violence that might have occurred around there. So we understand from a report and press releases that this was not part of an investigative missions sanctioned by the United Nations. This was just an official visit, but it has absolutely no investigative, it was not investigative in its nature. So that's very, very curious because very quickly in the report, we can find out that they actually did conducted some interview, not of victims, because victims don't want to talk about it because they've seen basically that the lie is out of the hat. And there's been so many debunking reports about the stories and the allegations which was brought forward and promoted by the pro-Israeli media, you name it, New York Times and company, is basically very difficult for the victims now because they know the credibility has been hurt. And I think that people have understood clearly that many lies have been told. Now, no one is denying that violence took place during the October the 7th, and I want to be very clear about that. This is not about denying that. But what we are saying is that we're questioning the role of the United Special Rapporteur on crime, social crimes, to take a team of 9 experts telling us this is not an investigation, yet conducting interviews with experts. This is what's unbelievable. She brought with her expert in ethical interviewing of survivors, victim, and witness. You don't go on an official visit for zero investigation and bring in these kind of people unless you are indeed conducting an investigation. So the first fact that I'd like to establish is that she lied. She said she was not an investigative trip, but they conducted an investigation. So this is not part of the mandate, yet she conducted an investigation. So that obviously bears for more question. The second aspect of that is to understand that this team of experts that has gone with her, we understand nobody's described who are these guys. It's important to understand who went there and what they've done over there. So the first thing we have to say is that, okay, we've got specialists trained in safe ethical interviewing and witness and sexual violence crimes, forensic pathologists, and a digital and open source information analyst going to Israel and the West Bank to conduct what is only can be called an investigation, not collecting information as they pretend to do. Now, they've got 4 agencies in the United Nations where you get these experts from. The first one is the DPO, the Department of Peace Operation. The other one is the OHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and then, of course, the Office of Pramila. So that's very important because now they're very well equipped, and we're going to see they're going to spend 15 days actually on the report. It says, and very few people have actually reported it properly, but the trip actually started on the 29th of January and ended on the 14th of February 2024. So that's 15 days, not 8 or 10 days as some people have reported. Now, what's really, really interesting is to understand that after this trip, she provided a report and she took part in a press conference on Monday where she basically described a little journey, a little trip out there, and basically relate to the world the message of what she observed there and how convincing the information she received during a trip were. So really, it's all in the details, as we said earlier. And the term convincing information, which she's using in a press release, in a report, and during a press conference, is very telling because she exactly got what she bartered for. She went there to receive information, and on the Israeli side, it was important that this information was convincing. So she came back reporting that she was convinced that the information she received was basically accurate and that eventually could lead to some kind of evidence that a conflict-related sexual crime was committed on the October the 7th, but also during the hostage situation, because part of the report is basically broke down on 4 major parts, if you will. The first one being the 7 October attacks, the victim, the witness, and the evidence. The second part being basically the hostage and abduction situation by Hamas and potential victims there as well. And then she also have a part in the report talking about the stakeholders in the West Bank, the Palestinian authorities, and engagement of the mission with these particular interlocutors. And then, of course, she talks about the victim and the problem between the security forces and the Palestinian in the West Bank, and the many claims, of course, of sexual abuse from the Palestinian women, children, and men, which they basically were subjected to during incarceration period. So it's a very concise, not too long, but very concise report. But this report is giving us a lot of information. And from the get-go, I would like to say that perhaps what the Israeli intended by having this report issues actually is going to literally blow back. It's going to blow back because it reveals how very little we know about the events and how very little evidence, if at all, that conflict-related sexual crime were committed on the October the 7th.
Yeah, it's really simple, Freddie. If this was a court of law in the West, if this was in France, or if this was in the UK or in the United States, there's a bar in terms of the burden of proof, right? Especially for high crimes and, felonies, murder, sexual assault, and so forth. There's sort of a basic bar, isn't there? A basic standard of proof. You can't have a secondhand claim by, let's say, the head of an Israeli rescue outfit like Zaka, who absolutely have a spotty record in terms of their own corruption scandals. But this is where, or IDF soldiers making statements to the press or on social media. And these things have all been debunked one after the other. There's a problem is there's no victims, there's no actual forensic evidence. Everybody's asking, looking, there's nothing. So nothing's been presented, but it's all been kind of kept shrouded in behind a kind of, I don't know, Freddie, an information firewall that's being put up by the Israeli government, and it's kind of being enabled and facilitated by a mainstream media that's just not pushing, not asking any questions. I don't see any Western journalists really holding the Israelis' feet to the fire to validate some of these claims. And here we have, as you said, this UN team or this international team coming in. By the looks of it, Freddie, am I wrong in saying that they're just there to help shore up the Israeli narrative? What do you think?
Well, at this stage, after analyzing the report, its contents, we can clearly see, and according to the press release as well, it's quite clear that Pramila and her team, when they're under a lot of pressure from Israel. So it's really interesting because we know that Israel has declared publicly that they will not give any longer visa. They will not basically provide visa for UN employees in Israel. Yet this particular team is getting a lot of attention. And I think that this was a calculation, a very smart calculation from the Israeli, which were trying to secure a UN stamp, if you will, on their propaganda. Because if the UN say it, then that would be a victory for the Israeli, because they know that the time is running out for Israel. And I think that their level of credibility is at the lowest as you can even imagine. And you can see even the United States starting to distance itself because they realize that they might have legal consequences to supporting Israel, not providing them only with weapons, but also with money and providing them with boots on the ground, intelligence support. So it's quite clear that at that moment in time, Israel is, see the value of having a mission. Even if it's not, as I say, investigative in nature, as it is claimed, it's important to have them basically convinced that the information at hand is of value for any kind of proceedings further down the line. Now, if you remember, Patrick, we know that the Israeli government and the Shin Bet has provided basically government around the world with informations, with a video and a movie, a documentary, if you will, that was basically shown around the world in our governments with selected influential people, governments, members of government and parliaments, being able to look into that. So clearly addressed and targeted to the politics, if you will, of our government, to have them completely, since there are, many had doubts, obviously, Israel ability basically for propaganda. So they needed to have this kind of material because the entire communication strategy is based on this particular photos and movies and staging and so on. So they need to have the UN as well as looking into that. And that's what this trip of Pramila was all about. Now, the lady herself is is very interesting. I mean, she's a bit naive, to be honest with you. We know she got pranked by the Russian, which got her to accept the idea that the Russian military was providing Viagra to their troops so they could better rape a Ukrainian woman. So that's how, the kind of person, is easy to convince, obviously. But I've kind of a breakdown the meeting and what they actually did during the 15 days they were out there. And you could see they're participating in 33 meetings with the Israeli national institutions. So they went on to meet the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Welfare, Social Affairs, Health and Justice, State Attorney General Office, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Security Agency, the Shin Bet, and the Israeli National Police in charge of this investigation. So very interesting that approach to go and meet, top guys within the governments, and then meeting also the president of Israel and the First Lady. And they went on to visit different military bases, the Shoah military base, the morgue to which the bodies of victims were transferred to, and then a visit to the Israeli Center for Forensic Medicine. So they really went around basically the house. And then, of course, the trip on site is probably where we want to go without further delay, because this is where really the goods are. And we can clearly see that they went to, I think, 5 destinations. They went to the Nova Music Festival and the surrounding areas. They went to the Road 232 and other escape. You all remember the pictures of this car, calcinated, completely destroyed. And that's certainly not a Kalashnikov that did that. We all know the Apache military from the Israeli Air Force basically were dispatched on the scene. And it is quite clear that, as you mentioned earlier, the Hannibal doctrine was deployed. And then they also went on different kibbutz Rahim. They went to the kibbutz Be'eri. They went to also, I think, the kibbutz Kfar Aza as well. And what's interesting is really getting the feedback from this particular exercise, because in the report from the get-go, we understand they were not able to interview the hostages. They were not, able to interview the victims of October 7, those that claimed to have been raped, or that the government had claimed they had been raped by the Hamas and those involved with this attack. So you're conducting an investigation, that is clear, because you are interviewing eyewitnesses. But on the other hand, you're not basically interviewing the real victim, those that should basically be able to tell you this is what happened. And this is when you really get, the sense of whether you've been lied to or you've been taken for a run, or whether this is actually really happened. And really the amount of details that goes into the reports, and each time you read the report, you realize that what they were provided was not actual evidence. They were not being able to look at the crime scene, in the presence of the victims, been able to reconstitute exactly how things happened. All they did is they were provided with about 5,000 pictures, 40 hours of video footage. And what they did is basically, cleverly, they presented the live scene, if you will, the cities, the kibbutz, the places where the crime allegedly took place, and then the so-called evidence that IDF and the Shin Bets are claiming were basically photos and pictures and footage. And they had to match that and then make a decision based on that. So that's the entire trip across the kibbutz, the bases. This is about looking at pictures, looking at listening to eyewitnesses and their claim. And on many, many occasions, perhaps on all visit to all the sites, they always come to the same conclusion, is that they cannot come to the conclusion that there are actual evidence of crimes perpetrated. All they call is there are convincing information that these crimes have occurred. But they're always asking the Secretary General to further the investigation and to go after the evidence, because right now all they have is convincing information.
Yeah, so they have no actual evidence, and they're looking for the crime. So there's this assumption that a crime's been committed. There's no evidence. They're looking for the evidence. Normally, the evidence comes first, and then that's used to justify mounting a major investigation. I mean, that's normally how it's done in a CSI criminal investigative format, Freddie, of course, but that's the reverse of what we're seeing here. It reminds me of Russiagate, actually. They start with the assumption that the Russians meddled in the 2016 election. Ergo, we need to mount an investigation and find some evidence of Russian meddling.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
Pramila Patten, so she is absolutely the perfect person to choose for this. For Ukraine, she helped to spin up this idea that the Russians were committing mass rape, and that they used it as a military strategy, rape as a weapon of war by the Russians against the Ukrainians, and then they would couch it in qualifiers, Freddie. Like, for instance, it's a hidden crime that's been committed. That's why there's not a lot of evidence. We know it's been committed. We don't have the evidence because it's a hidden crime, but it's devastating and it's used as a weapon of war, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, to think, Freddie, on October 7th, if you think about what Hamas and the Palestinian resistance factions achieved on that day by taking down a number of military bases, as well as communications towers, the eyes and the ears, breaching this wall, and capturing all of this territory deep into the Israeli-held areas along the border regions there with Gaza, that they have time amongst all that to stop and, go on sort of marauding rape gangs. I mean, just the idea of it is completely implausible, but this is what plays out in the Western media, Freddie, time and time again.
Yeah.
Once the idea is floated out, we'll talk about this after the break. We're going to take a break with the network here. I'm with Freddie Ponton, independent journalist from France. Freddie is joining us to talk about October 7th and what his view is of the recent report there with the UN's expert on sexual violence, Pramila Patten, and her fact-finding team. We'll talk about all this and more on the other side. I'm Patrick Henningsen. This is TNT. Stay there. We'll be right back.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
My company, weatherbell.com, has been out with our hurricane season from hell forecast since December. We figured the La Nina was going to come on strong, and in the meantime, the tropical Atlantic would stay very warm. This would promote a rotation of the Madden-Julian oscillation that was similar to 2005, 2017, 2020. Now, this Madden-Julian oscillation is a crucial aspect of forecasting the weather in the long range. The models are terrible with it, and so anyone that can figure out how to forecast the Madden-Julian oscillation will be able to come up with better forecasts, and that's not going to take artificial intelligence. One of the big things about the Madden-Julian oscillation is it reacts to sea surface temperatures. So if you don't know what's warming the ocean, it's not CO2 feedback, for goodness sakes. If you don't know what's warming the ocean, well, guess what? Since the Madden-Julian oscillation reacts to the ocean, you're in a heap of trouble. This whole thing has been bass-ackwards. We observe the atmosphere, we observe the sun, and yet 99% of the energy of the entire system is in the ocean. And we have virtually no data. One data point for every 112,000 square miles. They only go down to 6,000 feet, and the average depth of the ocean is 14,000 feet. In any case, a lot of forecasters are coming out with their hurricane forecast, and shock, it looks like the one we put out in December. This is TNT climate and weather watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you got.
Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to TNT. Today's News Talk. We're still in the first hour of this live broadcast. Very pleased to be joined on the line by Freddie Ponton, independent journalist from France, and also contributor at 21stCenturyWire.com as well. Freddie, on the October 7th narrative, why is this important? Because still, Freddie, 5+ months later, it's going to be 6 months pretty soon. I can't even tell you how ridiculous it is and depressing to even say this. There hasn't been a ceasefire in Gaza. And one of the reasons, Freddie, the justification for not having a ceasefire from the Israeli side and from the United States side is because what happened on October 7th was so horrific, it can never be allowed to happen again. Like, that's literally the clarion call. That's the talking point. It's all based on that. So what we're doing here, Freddie, is very important because we are deconstructing a lot of these claims and lies that, quite frankly, are propaganda. I mean, imagine, Freddie, imagine having a fact-finding mission, interviewing witnesses to a crime, but not actual victims of the crime. Second and third-hand witnesses. So basically, you could put anybody up, tell any kind of a story. If there's no forensic evidence to back it up, and a menage of edited photos and videos in a 47-minute highlight reel, as you said, which was shown to private audiences. The reason Israel didn't release that 47-minute special, VIP film about the atrocities of October 7th, because they didn't want to open it up to public scrutiny. That's why. Because they know if they put that out in public, it would get picked apart. We've seen parts of that which have been leaked and released, and parts of it have been debunked. Okay, so who knows if you're able to put the whole full-length propaganda film out, what would happen? That is by definition propaganda. This is not happening through normal media channels, Freddie. It's all being done and very carefully micromanaged by the government, who's being accused of genocide. You couldn't make this up, Freddie.
Yes, absolutely. And Pramila's trip with our expert team to Israel and the West Bank is an extension of a propaganda that is falling apart, because simply some very good work has been done, by the Grey Zone and other, Electronic Intifada, and all these guys, they've done some amazing work, and none of them, a lot of people have looked into it, have spent countless hours in debunking, not for the sake of debunking something because we hate Israel. This has nothing to do with that. That's what they want to portray you like, that we are just haters. We don't hate Israel, but we don't like to be told lies. And so we investigate, because that's our job as journalists, to be partial and to look at both sides of the story. The problem is when basically what is presented to us just simply doesn't add up, whether it is the headquarters of Hamas, beneath the Al-Shifa hospital with a couple of tunnels that was built, by the Egyptians, then you start to really worry about, a lot of these claims. And then we just have to listen to our colleagues, journalists, even the BBC, it doesn't matter. We just listen to their own experience, following the IDF in the Gaza Strip, and all come to the same conclusion, is that they are not basically war reporters. They are not following the soldiers. They're invited when the stage has been set, sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours after the event has taken place, giving plenty of time to stage whatever it is. And we saw that with the famous MRI room with the guns, but then the next pictures is less gun, then some guns were removed. You can clearly see that there's something going on here, and it's called staging. Staging, something that Israelis are they control pretty much Hollywood, so they're very good at staging and putting all these movies and scenes together to convince you that what you're saying is true. It's not real, and that's what people really need to understand. And so this trip, if you will, of the last minute, this last chance of proving and putting the UN stamp on what Israel is claiming is extremely important to them, because really it's falling apart in the Gaza Strip. It's falling apart in Israel. I don't think this government has much life left in it. And of course, for me, this investigation was the confirmation, if you will, of what we've been saying all along, is that people are starting to remove themselves from this particular situation because it's a hot potatoes. It's a hot potatoes because it's based on lies. And perhaps the most impressive for me example of that is the side of the report from Pramila and her team on the kibbutz Be'eri. And I'm going to go through that because I really want to take the time to deconstruct that so people can, it's not my words, these are the words of the United Nations report, all right? And you're going to understand very clearly what I'm talking about. Now, the mission team, when they arrived at the kibbutz Be'eri, they examined several allegations of sexual violence. And they say it must be noted that the witnesses and sources with whom the mission team engaged adopted actually over time an increasingly cautious and circumspect approach regarding past accounts, including in some cases retracting statement that was made previously. So that's very important, because the notions of retracting statement is already one clue, is that people are saying, oh, my recollections is not good, or perhaps I was told to say that, but now it's a hot potatoes, I want to maybe pull back. Some also stated that the mission team, that they no longer felt confident in their recollections of other assertions that had appeared in the media. Why is that? That is the work that we do every day. It's about basically pointing out to what's true and what is not. It is about the debunking of this propaganda. And when it becomes to a point that even the New York Times doesn't want even to touch it anymore. We haven't seen a piece of them coming out with Pramila, the big interview, podcast, and so on, because they can't, because they know that she's going to have to tell the truth. And the truth is that all she got is information fed in by the Israeli Shin Bet intelligence military, but actually does not consist an evidence you can take to the court and bag it. It's just simply not there. Now, they say that within the kibbutz Be'eri, going back to that, is that they say that at least two of the allegations of sexual violence, which were previously reported, they were determined by the mission team to be unfounded due to either new superseding information or inconsistency in the information that was gathered during the investigation. And that includes, listen to that, the responder testimonies, photographic evidence, and other informations. These words are very important because they're telling you that the first responders' testimonies cannot be taken. They cannot be taken seriously. There's inconsistency. There is superseding information. A lot of things just simply doesn't fit the bill. And I think that's really, for me, clearly stating that I think they might even probably have been surprised by the lack of inconsistency and the unwillingness of the victims and certain witnesses to come forward and actually come up with a very clear and concise story. And we saw, for example, you might have listened to that, heard that on the media, but they pushed that for a while, but it didn't last long, about this pregnant woman whose womb had reportedly been ripped open before she was killed, with a fetus stab while still inside her, the knife and all that kind of things, in the vagina. I mean, the whole thing was disgusting and gruesome. And eventually all that had to be dismissed because clearly none of it is true. And they've had to realize that by themselves. So I think what we can clearly see is that, and for me, which really what I found it is damaging from this report, is that they didn't go further to say that the crime scene had been altered by bomb squad and the bodies move, which explains some little girl was separated from her family and they claimed that she was taken aside from her family and raped and all that. And then when they got there, none of that was making sense either. So you can clearly see that as soon as you ask a couple of questions and the right questions, the story is falling apart. And the entire report, when you go through it, at least for the Israeli side of the visit, or what I call the guided tour, because at the end of the day, this tour is happening in a vacuum, if you will. It's very scripted. When you read it, you can see that everything has been taken care of, and it's taken care of by an organization called Zaka, ultra-Orthodox organization appointed by the Israeli intelligence and governments, basically responsible for sweeping the crime scenes and basically handing and removing the bodies from the crime scene. An organization, you will not be able to build credibility in any court of law because they were clearly basically involved in staging or in at least taking pictures, gathering some kind of information, which eventually they will want to call evidence. But the UN trip revealed that although there are some eyewitnesses' testimonies, just to be fair, that seems to indicate that they might have had some, conflict related sexual violence occurring in this particular site. Yet at this moment in time, upon this particular press conference on Monday, she was not able to really come up and say openly to the world, I have not convincing information, but really, really solid evidence that this has taken place, and we need now to move to a further legitimate mandated investigation. She couldn't do that. So what it is a media stunt. That's all it is on behalf and sponsored by the Israeli government.
No, I think it's pretty clear at this point. To give them a soft landing, Freddie, because all these things are going to get looked at and questioned as a result of the ICJ case. There's more than likely, eventually, we hope anyway, there'll be referrals to the International Criminal Court for individuals. But protecting this narrative is absolutely paramount, because what we've seen, Freddie, is extraordinary. After the ICJ case by South Africa, Israel's restricted aid. They've restricted aid deliveries into the Gaza Strip. So instead of opening up the aid spigot, they've closed it, they've throttled it. And the reasons they're giving for this is the threat of Hamas getting those supplies and hoarding them and keeping them for themselves and so forth. So it's all predicated on Hamas being this major, threat to not only Israel but Palestinians themselves, and this terrorist menace that needs to be literally exterminated right down to the last fighter. Basically. And so this is why this is important. This is why these narratives need to be challenged. And I think it's pretty obvious this is an act of desperation here by deploying Pramila Patten and her team to shore up the Israeli narrative. I think a lot of people see right through this, Freddie, and I think you've explained it extremely well. Certainly we'll be looking at more on this in the coming days and weeks, because this story has to be thoroughly audited, because quite frankly, the evidence isn't there for any of it. That's the problem. It's been the problem from the beginning, and people just need to keep chipping away at it. Journalists like yourself, Freddie, and you mentioned the Gray Zone, and others have done extraordinary work on this. New Dawn magazine's got the big feature, which I've written, which is out in the latest edition. I'll send that through to you as well, Freddie, so you can look at that. But you just got a minute left, Freddie. Your final thoughts before we break for the hour.
Well, but my final word on that is that Pramila Patten's team was indeed convinced by Israeli provided information, and that conflict-related sexual violence indeed took place, but they were certainly not convinced by the evidence. They found themselves, which makes this report purely a media stunt, in support of Israel, rather than actually a serious evidence-based report. And that's really the essence of what we saw with this press conference, telling us it was not an investigation, but it was telling us it was basically convincing information where we should have heard the word evidence. So clearly there's a discrepancy there. There's something is lacking, and what is lacking is the truth.
Yeah, well, exactly. And substance. Freddie Ponton, independent journalist, also a contributor at 21st Century Wire. We want to follow Freddie on X, Twitter, at LFC News Media. Just type Freddie Ponton into the search bar on X, Twitter, and you'll find him there. You want to be following Freddie because he does put out threads that are incredibly well researched and detailed. So if you want to stay ahead of a lot of the stories, ahead of the narrative, you want to be following journalists like Freddie. Freddie, thank you for joining us on TNT this week.
My pleasure.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen, as Freddie Ponton. Absolutely a devastating takedown of the October 7th narrative here. That's what we're doing on this program. We'll do more of it. Top of the hour news headlines coming up, and on the other side, we're going to connect with Basil Valentine. Boy, do we have a lot of stories to plow through, and some big ones at that. Looking forward to it. Stay right there. We'll be back in just a few on the other side.